It was October 10th, 2019, 2:47 in the morning. Officer Miguel Reyes was finishing his patrol shift along a canal in Albuquerque's South Valley when he saw her, a woman in white, standing at the water's edge. Her hair, long, black, hanging wet down her back, obscured her face as she bent toward the dark water. Miguel told investigators later that he could hear her from 50 feet away. A sound he described as not quite crying, not quite singing, something in between, something that made his skin crawl. He called out to her, asked if she needed help. The woman didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him at all. She just kept making that sound, that terrible keening wail. And then she was gone. Not walked away, not ran, just gone. Miguel radioed it in as soon as possible as a mental health crisis, possible suicide attempt. He searched the canal banks with his flashlight for 20 minutes, found nothing, wrote it off as exhaustion, the end of a long shift, maybe his eyes playing tricks. At 6:15 that morning, a jogger found the body of 7-year-old Isabella Cordova floating face down in that same stretch of canal. Her small hands were still clutching a white ribbon. Her mother would later testify that Isabella had been sleeping safely in her bed when she checked on her at midnight. The bedroom window, second story, was found open, the screen removed from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the soft earth beneath the window. No logical explanation for how a 7-year-old girl ended up in a canal 3 blocks from her home in the middle of the night. But there was one detail that made Miguel Reyes' blood run cold when he heard it. One detail that connected Isabella's death to a pattern stretching back over 400 years. When they pulled Isabella from the water, her hair was soaking wet, but arranged carefully down her back, almost ceremonially, and clutched in her other hand, the one not holding the ribbon, was a single white flower, a lily, the kind that doesn't grow anywhere near that canal. The kind that, according to Mexican folklore, La Llorona, the weeping woman, leaves with her victims. Welcome back to Folklore Forensics, where myth meets true crime. Every week, we take a famous folktale, myth, or legend and investigate it as if it were a real criminal case. We look at the evidence, examine the victims, profile the perpetrators, and try to understand not just what happened, but why these stories have survived for centuries. I'm your host, Danielle Christmas, and today we're diving into a case that spans centuries, that crosses borders, that blurs the line between historical fact and supernatural folklore so completely that even experienced investigators have struggled to separate truth from myth. We're talking about the Weeping Woman drownings, the La Llorona investigation, case file number 41. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. La Llorona, that's just a story, a cautionary tale Mexican parents tell their children to keep them away from rivers and canals at night. A ghost story, not a real case. And you'd be partially right. La Llorona is a story, one of the most widespread and enduring pieces of folklore in Latin American culture. But here's the thing that most people don't know, the thing that took me months of research to uncover. The legend of La Llorona is based on a real woman, a real crime, real victims. And even more disturbing, that original crime has inspired copycat killings for over 4 centuries, including at least 17 confirmed cases in the last 30 years alone. So today we're going to do something we've never done before. We're going to investigate a case that exists in 2 timelines simultaneously. We're going to look at the original crime, the one that started the legend, and we're going to examine how that legend has perpetuated violence across generations. This is the story of Maria de los Dolores Salazar, and this is the story of every woman who came after her, who heard her tale and saw in it not a warning, but a template. Before we get started, I need to give you a content warning. This episode contains disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. Before we get into the historical case, I want to start with the pattern, because that's what first caught the attention of investigators. That's what made them realize they weren't dealing with isolated incidents or accidents or coincidences. They were dealing with something much more deliberate, much more disturbing. Let's talk about pattern recognition. It's one of the most crucial tools in forensic investigation. Our brains are wired to find patterns. It's a survival mechanism. But sometimes patterns hide in plain sight for years, even decades, because they're spread across different jurisdictions, different time periods, different cultural contexts. That's what happened with the Weeping Woman drownings. The first person to notice the pattern was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic anthropologist at the University of New Mexico. In 2003, she was researching historical drowning cases in the Southwest for an entirely different project when she noticed something odd, something that made her stop and go back through her data. She found 17 cases over a 15-year period, 1988 to 2003, all involving children between the ages of 4 and 9, all drownings in canals, rivers, or irrigation ditches, all in communities with significant Mexican or Mexican-American populations, and all sharing a cluster of unusual characteristics that didn't fit typical accidental drowning profiles. Let me walk you through what she found, and I want you to listen carefully because these details matter. First, timing. 14 of the 17 drownings occurred between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. Now, that alone isn't necessarily suspicious. Children can wander at night, accidents happen, but it is unusual. Most childhood drowning deaths occur during daylight hours, during swimming or playing near water. Nighttime drownings are rare. Second, the victim's clothing. In 12 of the 17 cases, the children were found wearing white nightgowns or white clothing. Their regular pajamas were later found in their bedrooms, neatly folded. Someone had changed them, dressed them in white. In several cases, the white clothing didn't even belong to the child. It was too large, clearly adult-sized, tied or pinned to fit. Third, the flowers. In 9 cases, flowers were found with the bodies. White lilies, white roses, white carnations. Always white. Always fresh, even when the body had been in the water for hours or days. The flowers weren't growing near the drowning sites. Someone had brought them there, placed them deliberately. Fourth, and this is where it gets really disturbing, the hair. In every single case where the body was recovered within 24 hours of death, that's 13 out of the 17, the victim's hair had been carefully arranged, combed out, spread in the water or laid down the back. This is not something that happens naturally. Water tangles hair, pulls it across the face. Someone had taken the time to arrange these children's hair post-mortem. And fifth, the witness accounts. In 6 of the cases, someone reported seeing a woman in white near the drowning site within 24 hours of the body's discovery. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Long dark hair, white dress or gown, standing near water, often heard crying or wailing. In every single instance, when police tried to locate these women for questioning, they couldn't find them. No identification, no follow-up, just vanished. Now, Dr. Vasquez brought this pattern to the attention of the Albuquerque Police Department in 2004, and here's where the investigation hit its first major obstacle: jurisdiction and cultural sensitivity. These 17 cases were spread across New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and Southern California. Different states, different counties, different police departments. No centralized database had flagged them as related, and when Dr. Vasquez suggested they might be connected, that they might be homicides staged to look like accidents or supernatural events, she was met with, let's call it skepticism. Some of that skepticism was legitimate. 17 cases over 15 years across 4 states, that's a lot of ground to cover. a lot of different potential perpetrators. The idea of a single serial killer didn't quite fit. The idea of multiple copycat killers seemed far-fetched. But some of that skepticism was cultural. The cases primarily involved Mexican-American families, communities where La Llorona wasn't just a story, it was a deeply embedded cultural belief. When family members suggested that La Llorona had taken their children, some investigators dismissed it as superstition rather than examining what might be hiding behind that belief, what human agency might be exploiting that belief. And that's the crucial point here, because what Dr. Vasquez was suggesting wasn't that a ghost was killing children. She was suggesting that someone, or multiple someones, were using the legend of La Llorona as cover, as camouflage, that they were staging these deaths to look like the legendary weeping woman had claimed another victim, knowing that in these communities, that explanation would be accepted, that it would stop people from looking too closely, from asking too many questions. It took 3 more deaths before anyone listened to her. In the summer of 2006, 2 children drowned in El Paso, Texas, within 6 weeks of each other, both in the same irrigation canal, both dressed in white, both with flowers. The second victim, 6-year-old Mateo Ruiz, was the son of a city councilman. And when Mateo's father demanded answers, demanded a real investigation, suddenly the resources appeared. Suddenly, Dr. Vasquez's pattern analysis was taken seriously. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit got involved. They created a task force, started pulling records not just from the previous 15 years, but going back decades. And what they found was staggering. The pattern didn't start in 1988. That was just as far back as Dr. Vasquez had initially searched. When they expanded the timeline, they found cases matching the same profile going back to the 1950s, the 1920s, the 1890s. Every generation, in communities across Mexico and the American Southwest, children drowning under circumstances that matched the La Llorona legend almost exactly. Now, obviously, the further back you go, the less reliable the records become. Cause of death determinations in the 1890s weren't exactly rigorous, but the pattern was there, undeniable, consistent across more than a century. And that's when the investigation took a turn that nobody expected. That's when they started looking at the legend itself, not as folklore, not as superstition, but as a historical document, as a record of an actual crime. Because every legend starts somewhere. Every ghost story has a genesis point. And if the La Llorona legend had inspired copycat crimes for over 100 years, then maybe, just maybe, the original legend was based on a real woman, a real crime, a real perpetrator. They needed a historian, someone who could dig into colonial Mexican records, someone who could trace the legend back to its source. They found Dr. Carmen Flores, a professor of colonial Latin American history at UCLA. And what Dr. Flores uncovered in the archives of Mexico City changed everything. Mexico City, 1590, or as it was known then, the capital of New Spain, built quite literally on top of the ruins of the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. It was a city of stark contrasts, Spanish colonial architecture rising above indigenous foundations, Catholic churches constructed from the stones of demolished temples, a rigid social hierarchy that placed Spanish-born people above Spanish people born in the Americas, above indigenous people and enslaved Africans at the bottom. Into this world, Maria de los Dolores Salazar was born in 1568. Her mother was indigenous from a noble Aztec family that had lost everything in the conquest. Her father was Spanish, a minor official who never acknowledged her. She was mestiza, mixed race, which meant she existed in a kind of social limbo, not Spanish enough for the colonial elite, not indigenous enough for the native communities. But Maria was beautiful, strikingly so. Dr. Flores found multiple contemporary accounts that described her, tall with long black hair that reached her waist, dark eyes, a face that one Spanish priest described as disturbingly lovely, quote, as if God had crafted her specifically to test men's virtue. When Maria was 19 years old, she caught the attention of Don Nuño de Montes Claros, a Spanish nobleman who had recently arrived in Mexico City. Nuño was the second son of the Count, which meant he had a title but no inheritance. He'd come to New Spain to make his fortune, and he was charming, educated, and by all accounts, genuinely taken with Maria. They began a relationship. And here's where we need to understand the social context, because it matters. Nuño couldn't marry Maria. The racial and class differences made that impossible. But he could, and did, set her up in a small house on the outskirts of the city. He visited her regularly. He was, by the standards of the time, relatively generous. And Maria loved him. The historical records make that clear. Letters she wrote, testimony from neighbors, all confirm that Maria believed this was a real relationship, that eventually, somehow, they would find a way to be together properly. She gave birth to their first child in 1588, a son, Diego, then a daughter, Catalina, in 1590, and finally another son, Tomas, in 1592. For 4 years, this arrangement continued. Nuño visited, provided money, played with his children, and Maria waited, hoped, believed. And then in the spring of 1593, Nuño stopped coming. At first, Maria thought he was busy. Then she thought he was ill. She sent messages. They went unanswered. She went to his residence in the city center. She was turned away at the door. And then, in June of 1593, she found out why. Nuño was getting married to Doña Isabel de Velasco, the daughter of a wealthy Spanish merchant, a proper Spanish woman, a woman who could give him legitimate heirs, social standing, access to her father's fortune. The wedding was announced publicly. It was going to be the social event of the season. And Maria and her 3 children, were simply erased, as if they had never existed. Now, I want to be clear about something. What happened next was a tragedy, a crime, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. Maria was a woman with no legal rights, no social standing, no recourse. She couldn't sue for support. She couldn't claim her children were legitimate. Under colonial law, she essentially had no options. She and her children were completely dependent on Nuño's goodwill, and he had withdrawn it entirely. Neighbors later testified that they saw Maria's mental state deteriorate rapidly over the following weeks. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She would stand outside her house at night staring toward the city center where Nuño lived and weep, just weep for hours. One neighbor, a woman named Juana Cortez, testified that she tried to help, brought food, offered to watch the children, but Maria was unreachable, lost in her grief and rage. The wedding was scheduled for August 15th, 1593, the Feast of the Assumption. On the night of August 14th, Maria dressed her children in white. Diego was 5 years old. Catalina was 3. Tomas was barely 1, still nursing. She told them they were going on an adventure, a special trip. She walked them through the dark streets to the canal that ran along the southern edge of the city. The same canal that had once been part of the Aztec community, the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan. And there, one by one, she drowned them. Diego first. He was old enough to understand, to fight. The coroner's report noted bruising on his arms where she'd held him under. Catalina went into the water crying for her mother, not understanding. And Tomas was so small that it took almost no time at all. Maria laid their bodies out on the canal bank, arranged their hair, placed white lilies stolen from a church garden in their hands, and then she walked to the center of the city, to the plaza in front of the cathedral, and she started screaming. Not words, just screaming, a sound that witnesses described as inhuman, as the sound of a soul tearing itself apart. The city guard arrested her. She didn't resist, didn't speak, just kept making that terrible sound. The bodies were discovered at dawn by a farmer bringing produce to market. 3 small children in white laid out like offerings, flowers in their hands, the water still dripping from their hair. The trial was swift. Maria confessed immediately, told them everything, said she'd killed her children so that Nuño couldn't have them, so that his new wife couldn't replace them with legitimate heirs, said she'd killed them because she loved them too much to let them grow up as she had, unwanted, unacknowledged, belonging nowhere. The court sentenced her to death. She was executed by garrote on September 3rd, 1593, in the same plaza where she'd been arrested. She was 25 years old. And here's where the legend begins, because Maria's last words, spoken from the scaffold, were recorded by multiple witnesses. She said, quote, "I will search for my children until the end of time. I will weep for them by every river, every canal, every body of water in this land, and I will not rest until I find them." Within weeks, people started reporting sightings. A woman in white by the canals, weeping, searching, calling for her children. The legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman, was born. Now, Dr. Flores found all of this in the colonial archives. Trial records, witness testimony, even a letter from Nuño to his brother in Spain, written a year after Maria's execution, in which he expressed mild regret about the, quote, unfortunate incident with the mestiza woman. He never faced any consequences, by the way, married his Spanish bride, had 4 legitimate children, died wealthy and respected in 1631. But Maria's story didn't die. It spread, evolved, became a cautionary tale told to children. Stay away from the water at night, or La Llorona will take you. Became a ghost story, became folklore. And somewhere along the way, it became something else. It became a template. So now we have 2 parallel investigations happening. The historical one, how Maria was caught in 1593, and the modern one, how investigators in the 2000s started connecting contemporary cases to this centuries-old crime. Let's start with the historical investigation because it's actually fascinating how thorough it was, even by today's standards. In 1593, the Spanish colonial authorities took crime seriously, especially when it involved children. The viceroy at the time, Luis de Velasco, ordered a full investigation. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined the bodies, documented everything. The investigation was led by a man named Rodrigo de Albornoz, who served as the city's chief constable. And Albornoz was good at his job. The records show that he approached the case methodically. He established a timeline, identified the victims, determined cause of death, drowning in all 3 cases with no other injuries except the bruising on Diego's arms. He interviewed Maria's neighbors who testified about her deteriorating mental state. He interviewed the guards who had arrested her in the plaza. He even, and this is remarkable, interviewed Nuño. Nuño admitted the relationship, admitted the children were his. But he claimed he'd ended things appropriately and had no idea Maria would react so violently. He expressed shock, horror, said he'd had no warning that she was capable of such an act. The records suggest Albornoz didn't entirely believe him. There are notes in the margins of the investigation file, Dr. Flores found these, where Albornoz wrote that Nuño's testimony seemed rehearsed and that his grief seemed performative. But Nuño was a Spanish nobleman. Maria was a mestiza woman with no legal standing. There was never any question of charging him with anything. The investigation focused entirely on Maria. And Maria, as I mentioned, confessed immediately, gave a full account of what she'd done and why. The only question was whether she was sane enough to stand trial. A priest was brought in to evaluate her, Father Cristobal de Medina. His report still exists in the archives, and it's heartbreaking, actually. He wrote that Maria was, quote, consumed by a grief so profound it had transformed into madness, but that she understood the nature of her actions and the difference between right and wrong. She was, in his assessment, legally sane. The trial lasted 1 day. The verdict was never in doubt. Maria was sentenced to death, and the sentence was carried out 2 weeks later. But here's what's interesting. After Maria's execution, Albornoz continued investigating. He was bothered by something. The staging of the bodies, the white clothing, the flowers. It was all so deliberate, so ritualistic. He found out that Maria had been asking questions in the weeks before the murders, talking to older indigenous women in the community, asking about pre-Columbian rituals, about Aztec beliefs regarding child sacrifice in the afterlife. See, before the Spanish conquest, the Aztecs had practiced child sacrifice in certain circumstances. Children who died by drowning were believed to go to Tlalocan, a paradise ruled by the rain god Tlaloc. It was considered one of the best possible afterlives. Albornoz theorized, and he wrote this in his final report, that Maria had been trying to ensure her children would go to this paradise, that she'd been blending Catholic and indigenous beliefs, trying to give her children the best possible death since she couldn't give them a good life. The church didn't like this theory. It suggested that indigenous beliefs were still being practiced, which undermined their conversion efforts. Albornoz's report was filed away and largely forgotten, until Dr. Flores found it in 2007. And this is where the modern investigation really took off, because Dr. Flores realized that if Maria had been researching rituals, if she'd been deliberately staging the murders to match indigenous beliefs about death and the afterlife, then the staging itself was part of the crime. It was a signature. And if modern perpetrators were copying that staging, the white clothing, the flowers, the arranged hair, then they weren't just inspired by the legend, they were copying the original crime, which meant they knew details that weren't part of the popular folklore, details that only appeared in historical records. Someone had done their research. The FBI task force started looking at the modern cases with this new framework. They went back through every case in Dr. Vasquez's pattern analysis and looked for additional details, things that matched the original crime but weren't part of the common La Llorona story. And they found them. In the 2006 El Paso cases, the ones that had finally gotten the investigation taken seriously, both children had been found with their arms crossed over their chests. That detail hadn't been released to the media, but it matched exactly how Maria had positioned her children's bodies in 1593. In a 1998 case in Tucson, the victim, a 5-year-old girl named Rosa Delgado, had been found with a specific type of white lily, Lilium candidum, the Madonna lily, the same type that grew in church gardens in colonial Mexico, the same type Maria had used. In a 2001 case in Albuquerque, the victim's mother reported that her daughter's hair had been braided in a very specific style before she disappeared. When the body was found, the braid had been undone and the hair arranged loose. That matched testimony from Maria's trial about how she'd unbraided Catalina's hair before placing her body on the canal bank. These weren't details from folklore. These were details from historical records, records that were buried in archives, records that you'd have to actively seek out. The task force realized they were looking for someone, or multiple someones, who had researched the original case, who had access to historical documents, who knew the real story behind the legend. They started looking at academics, historians, graduate students, anyone who might have accessed the colonial archives in Mexico City or the Spanish colonial records held in various American universities. And in 2008, they got their first break. A librarian at the University of Texas, El Paso contacted the task force. She'd been following the case in the news, and something had triggered her memory. In 2005, a woman had come in requesting access to their collection of Spanish colonial documents. She'd spent weeks going through records related to crime and punishment in 16th century Mexico City. The librarian remembered her because she'd been so intense, so focused, and because she'd specifically requested documents related to child murders. The woman had signed in using her real name and university ID. She was a graduate student in history at UTEP. Her name was Patricia Ochoa. And Patricia Ochoa's daughter, 7-year-old Sophia, had drowned in an El Paso irrigation canal in 2006, one of the 2 cases that had finally gotten the investigation taken seriously. Patricia had reported Sophia missing, had been interviewed by police, had played the grieving mother, and the case had been ruled an accidental drowning. But now, with this new information, investigators took another look, and the case fell apart. Sophia hadn't wandered away from home. Patricia had taken her, had dressed her in a white nightgown that she'd sewn herself, copying a pattern from a 17th century garment she'd seen in a museum, had walked her to the canal, had drowned her, had staged the body exactly as Maria de los Dolores Salazar had staged her children's bodies in 1593. When confronted with the evidence, Patricia confessed, and what she told investigators was chilling. She said she'd been fascinated by the La Llorona legend since childhood, had studied it academically, had eventually found the historical records of the original case, and she'd become obsessed. She said Maria was a woman who had been wronged by a system that gave her no power, no voice, no options, that Maria's crime was an active agency of control, of righteous revenge. Patricia's own life had some parallels. She was a single mother. Sophia's father had left when she was pregnant. She was struggling financially, academically, emotionally, and somewhere in her obsession with Maria's story, she'd started to see her own daughter as a burden, as something holding her back. She said, and this is a direct quote from her confession, quote, "Maria freed her children from a life of suffering. I freed Sophia. Now she's at peace, and I can finally breathe." Patricia Ochoa was arrested in November 2008. She was the first modern La Llorona copycat to be definitively identified and charged, but she wasn't the last. So now we need to talk about the psychology here, because we're dealing with two different types of perpetrators across two different time periods, and understanding their motivations is crucial to understanding these cases. Let's start with Maria because she's the original, the template. Modern forensic psychologists have analyzed Maria's case extensively, and there's pretty strong consensus about her psychological state. She was experiencing what would now be recognized as a major depressive episode with psychotic features, triggered by the abandonment and compounded by her complete lack of social support or legal recourse. But it's important to understand that Maria's crime wasn't impulsive. It was planned. She spent weeks preparing, researching, making decisions about how to do it, when to do it, how to stage it. That level of planning indicates that while she was deeply disturbed, she was also functioning cognitively. She knew what she was doing. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who consulted on the modern cases, described Maria's crime as altruistic filicide, killing one's children out of a distorted sense of love. Maria genuinely believed she was saving her children from a worse fate, from growing up as she had, marginalized and powerless. But there was also a revenge component. The timing, the night before Nuño's wedding, wasn't coincidental. The public nature of her breakdown in the plaza wasn't coincidental. She wanted Nuño to know, to suffer, to live with what he'd driven her to do. It's a complex psychological profile. Grief, rage, love, revenge, psychosis, all tangled together. And that complexity is part of what's made her story so enduring. She's not a simple villain. She's a tragedy. Now, the modern copycats are different. They're not experiencing the same circumstances as Maria. They're not abandoned women with no legal rights in a colonial society. They're living in the 21st century with access to resources, support systems, legal protections. So why are they copying her crime? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit identified several common factors among the modern perpetrators. First, a pre-existing fascination with the La Llorona legend. All of the identified copycats had a documented interest in the story. Some had studied it academically, like Patricia Ochoa. Others had grown up hearing it and become obsessed. Second, a personal crisis involving motherhood, financial stress, relationship breakdown, postpartum depression, feelings of being trapped or overwhelmed. The specific circumstances varied, but there was always a trigger. Third, access to information about the historical case. This is crucial. The copycats weren't just inspired by the folklore. They'd researched the real crime. They knew details that allowed them to recreate it accurately. And fourth, a distorted identification with Maria. They saw her as a figure of power, of agency. They reframed her crime from a tragedy into an act of liberation. The last point is really important because it shows how folklore can be reinterpreted. The traditional La Llorona story is a cautionary tale, a warning about the consequences of rage and revenge. But these women were reading it differently. They were seeing Maria as someone who took control of her narrative, even if that control was destructive. Let me tell you about two more specific cases because they illustrate different aspects of this profile. In 2012, in Phoenix, Arizona, a woman named Gabriela Ruiz drowned her 4-year-old son Mateo in a canal. Gabriela was a high school teacher, well respected in her community, no history of mental illness or violence. But investigators found that Gabriela had been active in online forums discussing La Llorona. She'd written extensively about Maria, arguing that Maria had been a victim of colonial oppression and that her crime was a form of resistance. Gabriela's husband had recently filed for divorce and was seeking full custody of Mateo. Gabriela was facing the possibility of losing her son, and in her mind, influenced by her obsession with Maria's story, she decided that if she couldn't have Mateo, no one would. She researched the historical case, recreated the staging, even wrote a note that she left at the scene, quoting Maria's last words, "I will search for my children until the end of time." Gabriela was arrested within 48 hours. She confessed immediately, just as Maria had, said she'd given Mateo, quote, "a better death than a life without his mother." She was convicted of first-degree murder in 2013 and sentenced to life without parole. The second case I want to tell you about is different. It's from 2015 in Las Cruces, New Mexico. A woman named Carmen Delgado was arrested for the attempted drowning of her 6-year-old daughter, Lucia. Attempted. Lucia survived. Carmen had taken Lucia to the Rio Grande at night, dressed her in white, brought flowers. She'd waded into the water with her daughter. But at the last moment, the very last moment, she couldn't do it. She pulled Lucia back, carried her to shore, called 911 herself. Carmen's case is important because it shows the psychological breaking point. She'd been planning this for months, had researched Maria's case, had convinced herself that this was the right thing to do. But when it came to the actual moment, her love for her daughter was stronger than her identification with the legend. Carmen was evaluated by multiple psychiatrists. They found that she'd been experiencing severe postpartum depression. Lucia had a younger sibling, a 2-year-old, combined with financial stress and an abusive relationship. She'd become fixated on the La Llorona story as a way out, as a solution. But she wasn't psychotic. She knew right from wrong. She just couldn't see any other option until she was literally in the water with her daughter. Carmen pleaded guilty to attempted murder and child endangerment. She was sentenced to 15 years, but was released after 8 for good behavior and successful completion of mental health treatment. She's now an advocate for maternal mental health awareness. These cases show the range of perpetrators we're dealing with. Some, like Patricia Ochoa and Gabriela Ruiz, fully committed to the crime. Others, like Carmen Delgado, pulled back at the last moment. But all of them were influenced by the legend. All of them saw Maria's story and found something in it that spoke to their own pain. And that's the disturbing power of folklore. It can preserve history, teach lessons, create cultural identity. But it can also provide a script for violence, a template that says, this is how you do it. This is how you take control. This is how you make your pain mean something. So we've talked about how Maria was caught in 1593. She essentially turned herself in. But how did modern investigators identify and apprehend the copycat killers? That's what I want to focus on now. The breakthrough in the modern investigation came from combining old-fashioned detective work with new technology. Once the task force understood they were looking for people who had researched the historical case, they could narrow their suspect pool significantly. They started with library records, universities, public libraries, historical societies, anywhere that held Spanish colonial documents or specialized collections on Mexican folklore. They requested records of anyone who had accessed materials related to La Llorona, child murder in colonial Mexico, or Marias de los Dolores Salazar specifically. Now, this was legally complicated. Library records are protected, but in cases involving child murders, courts were willing to issue warrants, and the search paid off. They identified 17 individuals who had accessed relevant materials in the 5 years preceding a drowning case in their geographic area. 17 people who had both the knowledge and the opportunity. Patricia Ochoa was one of them. So was Gabriela Ruiz. So was Carmen Delgado. But the task force didn't just rely on library records. They also used forensic evidence that had been overlooked in the original investigations. Remember, many of these cases had been ruled accidental drownings or isolated incidents. The crime scenes hadn't been processed as thoroughly as they should have been, but evidence had been collected and stored. And now with new technology and a new framework, investigators went back through it. In several cases, they found trace evidence that linked the victims to specific locations before they ended up in the water. Pollen samples, soil samples, plant material. This allowed them to reconstruct the victims' movements and identify where they'd been taken before being drowned. In the 2006 El Paso case, Patricia Ochoa's daughter Sophia, forensic botanists identified pollen on Sophia's nightgown that came from a specific type of flower, white roses, the same type that had been found with her body. And those roses were traced to a garden center where Patricia had purchased them 2 days before Sophia's death. In the 2012 Phoenix case, Gabriela Ruiz's son Mateo, investigators found fibers on Mateo's body that matched a white dress Gabriela had sewn herself. She'd made it specifically for the murder, copying a historical pattern. When they searched her home, they found the sewing materials, the pattern, and a draft of the note she'd left at the scene. But the case that really showed how far forensic technology had come was the 2019 Albuquerque case, the one I told you about at the beginning of this episode, Isabela Cordova. Remember, Officer Miguel Reyes had seen a woman in white at the canal just hours before Isabela's body was discovered. At the time, he'd written it off, but after Isabela's death was connected to the La Llorona pattern, investigators took his account seriously. They pulled surveillance footage from every camera within a mile of that canal. Traffic cameras, business security cameras, doorbell cameras, and they found her. A woman in a white dress walking toward the canal at 2:30 a.m., carrying something. The footage was grainy, but image enhancement technology allowed them to see that she was carrying a child in white. They traced her route backward through multiple cameras, followed her to a residential neighborhood, identified the house she'd come from. The house belonged to Isabela's aunt, her mother's sister, a woman named Veronica Cordova. Veronica had been at the family's home that evening. She'd helped put Isabela to bed. She'd been one of the first people called when Isabela was discovered missing. She'd comforted Isabela's mother, helped search for the little girl. And she'd been the one who killed her. When investigators searched Veronica's home, they found everything. A white dress still damp, white lilies in her refrigerator, and a notebook. Pages and pages of research on Maria. Copies of historical documents. Sketches of how to stage a body. A timeline of other La Llorona drownings. Veronica had been planning this for over a year. She'd researched the legend, found the historical case, studied the copycat crimes. She'd been waiting for the right opportunity. The motive was complicated. Veronica had struggled with infertility for years, had undergone multiple rounds of IVF, all unsuccessful. She'd become increasingly bitter about her sister's children, increasingly obsessed with the idea that her sister didn't deserve them, didn't appreciate them. And somewhere in that bitterness and obsession, she'd found the La Llorona legend, and she decided that if she couldn't have children, she would take her sisters, not to raise them, but to free them, to give them the peaceful death that Maria had given her children. Isabela was supposed to be the first. Veronica had plans for her sister's other 2 children as well. She was arrested on October 19, 2019, 9 days after Isabela's body was found. The surveillance footage and the evidence from her home were overwhelming. She confessed, gave a full account, said she'd been inspired by Maria's courage, said she'd felt a spiritual connection to the weeping woman. Veronica Cordova went to trial in 2021. The prosecution had surveillance footage, forensic evidence, her own confession, and her notebook full of research and planning. The defense tried to argue insanity, but psychiatric evaluations found her competent. She knew what she was doing. She'd planned it meticulously. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Let's talk about outcomes, because in a case that spans over 4 centuries, there are a lot of outcomes to discuss. Maria de los Dolores Salazar was executed on September 3, 1593. She was 25 years old. She died by garrote in the main plaza of Mexico City in front of a crowd of hundreds. Contemporary accounts say she was calm, that she didn't fight or plead, that her last words were the ones I mentioned earlier, a promise to search for her children forever, to weep by every body of water until she found them. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery of the Church of San Francisco. The location has been lost to time. The church itself was demolished in the 19th century. But her story didn't die with her. Within months of her execution, the legend began to spread. People reported seeing a woman in white by the canals, hearing weeping in the night. The story traveled from Mexico City to other parts of New Spain. It evolved, changed, adapted to local contexts. By the 1600s, La Llorona was a well-established piece of folklore throughout Mexico. By the 1700s, the legend had spread to what is now the American Southwest. By the 1800s, it was one of the most widespread and enduring pieces of Latin American folklore. And somewhere along the way, the real Maria, the woman who had been driven to murder by abandonment and despair, became a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a monster. The legend served a purpose. It kept children away from dangerous waterways. It reinforced social norms about motherhood and proper behavior. It gave communities a way to talk about the very real dangers of domestic violence, abandonment, and maternal mental health without having to address them directly. But it also did something else. It preserved the memory of a crime, and it provided a template for future crimes. As for the modern copycats, the outcomes vary. Patricia Ochoa, the first identified copycat, was convicted of first-degree murder in 2009. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She's currently incarcerated at the Central New Mexico Correctional Facility. She's appealed her conviction twice. Both appeals were denied. Gabriela Ruiz, the Phoenix teacher who drowned her son in 2012, was also convicted of first-degree murder, life without parole. She's serving her sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville. Carmen Delgado, who pulled back at the last moment and saved her own daughter, pleaded guilty to attempted murder and child endangerment. She was sentenced to 15 years, served 8, and was released in 2023. She's now living in Colorado, working with a nonprofit that provides mental health services to new mothers. She's written a memoir about her experience. She speaks publicly about maternal mental health and the dangers of untreated postpartum depression. And Veronica Cordova, who killed her niece Isabella in 2019, was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and child abuse resulting in death. She was sentenced to life without parole plus 30 years. She's currently at the New Mexico Women's Correctional Facility. In total, the FBI task force has identified and prosecuted 11 copycat killers between 2008 and 2023. All have been convicted. All are serving significant prison sentences. But here's the thing. The task force has only been able to definitively solve cases from the 1990s onward. Earlier cases, the ones from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, remain officially unsolved. The evidence is too degraded, the record's too incomplete. The perpetrators, if they're still alive, too difficult to identify. Dr. Vasquez estimates that there are at least 40 unsolved cases that fit the La Llorona pattern. 40 children whose deaths were dismissed as accidents or isolated incidents. 40 families who never got justice. And that's just the cases we know about, the ones that were documented. How many others were there? How many children drowned under suspicious circumstances in communities where La Llorona was blamed and no investigation was conducted? We'll never know. The task force officially closed in 2022, but the FBI maintains an open file on La Llorona-related cases. If new evidence emerges, if new cases are identified, they can reopen the investigation. As for the families of the victims, both historical and modern, the outcomes are what you'd expect: grief, trauma, lives forever changed. Isabella Cordova's mother, Elena, has become an advocate for child safety and mental health awareness. She speaks at schools and community centers about recognizing warning signs, about the importance of family support systems, about how folklore, while culturally important, shouldn't prevent us from asking hard questions when children die. The families of Maria's children, Diego, Catalina, and Tomas, are lost to history. We don't know if they had other relatives who mourned them, if anyone remembered them beyond their role in their mother's crime. But we know their names now. Dr. Flores' research brought them back, gave them identities beyond La Llorona's victims. And maybe that's something. Maybe that's a small piece of justice 400 years too late. Maria de los Dolores Salazar, executed in 1595 for the murder of her 3 children. Diego, 5 years old, Catalina, 3, Tomas, 1. Patricia Ochoa, Gabriela Ruiz, Carmen Delgado, Veronica Cordova, all convicted between 2013 and 2019 for drowning deaths that followed the same pattern, the same ritual, the same legend. Isabella Cordova, 7 years old, the victim who broke the case open. And 40 other cases, maybe more, that remain unsolved. Children whose deaths were attributed to accidents, to folklore, to acts of God. Families who never got answers. The legend continues. It's too deeply embedded in culture to disappear. And behind every telling of that legend are real victims, real crimes, real families still grieving. That concludes case file number 41, The Weeping Woman Drownings. But the story doesn't end there. Keep listening for a brief case epilogue on the afterlife of this legend. In 1993, exactly 400 years after Maria de los Dolores Salazar drowned her children, something remarkable happened on the banks of a canal in Mexico City. It was dawn. The sky was that particular shade of gray-blue that comes just before sunrise. The canal was still, reflecting the clouds, the buildings, the ancient waterways that had once been part of Tenochtitlan. The same waterways where Maria had drowned Diego, Catalina, and Tomas. Hundreds of women gathered there. They wore white. They carried white flowers, lilies and roses, armfuls of them. They stood along the banks in silence as the sun began to rise. This was a part of a government ceremony, a formal acknowledgement of the countless women throughout history who had been failed by systems that gave them no legal recourse, no protection, no options. It wasn't specifically about La Llorona, but the date wasn't a coincidence. The location wasn't a coincidence. As the sun broke over the horizon, a choir began to sing, a traditional song of mourning, and the women stepped forward one by one and released their flowers into the water. White lilies, white roses, hundreds of them, floating on the surface of the canal, carried by the current, drifting past the modern city that had grown up over the ruins of the old one. One of the organizers, a historian named Dr. Luz Mendoza, said something that stayed with me. She said, quote, "We don't forgive what she did. We can't, but we can finally grieve for the woman she might have been in a world that had given her any other choice." The flowers floated for miles, past neighborhoods and parks and schools, past places where children played safely in the daylight. White petals on dark water, dissolving slowly into the current, into memory. 400 years of a legend born from a crime, born from an injustice. The flowers are gone now, but the canal still flows, the legend still spreads, and somewhere tonight, a mother is telling her child to stay away from the water, because La Llorona is listening. Next week, we'll reopen another case, examining legends and lore through the lens of true crime. I'm Danielle Christmas, and you've been listening to Folklore Forensics. Folklore Forensics is written and hosted by me and produced by Audio Ellis. Theme music is by the Soundlings and Josh Pan. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow Folklore Forensics on Instagram at Folklore Forensics. Please send future case suggestions to folkloreforensicspod@gmail.com. Until next time, stay curious and always follow the evidence.